think one of the things that's critical as a leader, you have to be willing to do what's right by the institution in your best judgment and be honest about that, even if it's risking your career. I may come home without a job tonight. We just need to be really clear on that, and I think you have to be okay with that decision and be prepared for it and realize that your identity is not being president, that your identity is really separate from that. You have to find your way, I think, if you're going to lead with true integrity, to putting it all on the line to do what you think is right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of IngenioUs, the podcast where we have conversations with higher education's most creative thinkers and leaders. In this current season, I am focusing on extraordinary women leaders, women who are navigating complexity, leading through change, and shaping the future of higher education in powerful and distinctive ways. And I am especially excited to introduce today's guest, President Krista Newkirk of the University of Redlands. Krista is a leader whose journey is anything but traditional. From her early years growing up in a cattle ranch in Missouri to her career as an attorney to becoming a college president, her story is one of resilience, courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right, even when the stakes are high. What makes Krista such a compelling leader and such a fascinating conversation partner is her ability to bring together analytic rigor and deep humanity. She is a strategic thinker, a problem solver, and at her core, a listener. In fact, as you will hear, listening is not just something she values, it's a leadership superpower that shapes how she makes decisions, builds trust, and leads institutions through transformation. In this episode, we explore her journey into the presidency, what she's learned about the realities of leadership, and how she has led significant change, including institutional mergers, while staying grounded in mission and values. We also talk about the courage it takes to lead with integrity, the importance of surrounding yourself with the right people, and what higher education leadership will require in the years ahead. Here's my conversation with President Krista Newkirk. President Newkirk, I am delighted to welcome you to the IngenioUs community.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, Melissa.
Now, we like to start by finding out something about the leadership journey of our guests. And so, can you tell us where the story begins for you?
Yeah, I think my story really begins. My formative years were spent on a cattle ranch in Missouri. And my parents moved my two older brothers and me to that ranch when I was about 5 years old. And we built that ranch from scratch. We built a house and raised a barn and bought cows and started this whole adventure together. But my father passed away suddenly when I was 8 years old. And so that left my mother with a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old sons, and then me, and 200 head of cattle and 3 horses and a myriad of pets and such. And so I took on a lot of responsibility at that age. My mom had to go back to work, and I would come home and often, um, split wood or feed cows or make dinner. And at a young age that I could do a lot more than I thought I could do. And while it was really hard, it gave me a sense of confidence and responsibility and a work ethic that I think has stuck with me to this day.
I can only imagine. That is a very compelling story, and the way in which those early experiences must translate into the kind of leader you are.
Yeah, I think you learn that hardships are not forever. And also, the good times aren't forever. And you just have to kind of take it and realize that life has those ebbs and flows, and nothing will last forever, right?
Yeah, that's a hard lesson to learn early, and one I'm sure you look back on and reflect on quite often.
Yeah.
So now you began your career in law, I believe, before
Yeah.
moving into higher education. So what was it that drew you into to law as a profession?
You know, it really started during that time when my father passed away. Neither of my parents had graduated from college, and when it was about 1979, 1980, we were going through that recession at the time. I was watching them struggle, facing foreclosure of the ranch that we had just started, right? It was a really hard time. And I was watching them struggle for answers, and then my father passed away suddenly from a stroke at the age of 40, and I was watching my mother trying to deal with all of those issues, and the person who seemed to have all of the answers was my father's estate attorney, who was a woman, which was pretty unusual at the time, and so I was watching my mother go through all of this and trying to figure all of it out. And as a, typical stay-at-home mom, I mean, think about the time, right? She'd just gotten access to bank accounts that she could have on her own because that wasn't allowed. There was a lot of inequity still, and it was an uphill battle for her. And I saw this woman attorney who seemed to have all the answers, and I thought from a very young age, that's what I want. I want to have the answers. And so that was the path I chose at a very young age.
That's a powerful image. Actually,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. And
of
how
your
important representation is, I think. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, the fact that that's stuck and still is in your mind as you think about how you wound up in law. So what about then the journey into higher education? How did that happen?
Yeah. So, my grandfather was mortified that I was gonna be a lawyer. He viewed that as completely unethical, and he I adored him, and he refused to tell people that I was going to law school. Like, he would just go, "Well, she thinks maybe she wants to go to law," and didn't wanna talk about it. And I kept thinking about his legacy that he had. He was an educator. He dropped out of high school, graduated much, much later, shortly before my dad graduated from high school, actually went on to get his bachelor's degree and then his master's degree and became a superintendent of boarding schools that was associated with our religion. He made it a point by the first day of class to know every student by name. And 50 years later, we would go to church together and he could still recognize them and knew their name, which to me it's still amazing. I don't have that skill, always aspired to. But I think it was that early exposure to education and how fulfilling that was for him. And then I just loved learning. I discovered when I was in college how much I loved learning. And I thought, gosh, if there was a way to be around people who are constantly curious and exploring and doing research and learning more, that would be ideal. And I couldn't figure out how to get back there until the University of North Carolina at Charlotte placed an ad in the newspaper for an attorney. And I somehow convinced them that my broad practice would transfer into higher education law, which might have been my best advocacy work ever, honestly, because I was drinking from a fire hose. But I just loved it. I loved the environment. It was the best client I ever had. I just having that connection to purpose was really fulfilling for me from day one.
So take us forward then to your first presidency. So how did you go from college lawyer, college attorney to your first presidency, which I believe was at Converse College?
I was so I was in-house counsel for the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and after the recession of 2008, 2009, we were a state institution, nobody was getting raises, had been furloughed for multiple years. I mean, it was pretty rough. And the chancellor walked into my office one day and shut the door and sat down, and that was pretty unusual. And he said, so the board of trustees tells me I need a chief of staff, and I've never had one before. I don't know that I want one, but if I'm going to do this, I'd like you to come and do it with me. I started laughing and I said, well, you're selling it so far, sir. Tell me more. So he gave me this great offer of you'll get a raise if you don't like it, or if I decide the role isn't working out, you can always go back to being an attorney. You can take the raise with you, but even then, I didn't wanna be a glorified executive assistant. I really wanted to know what the meat of the job was gonna be and what my career path was gonna be because I didn't wanna get derailed from what I thought was a pretty good opportunity at general counsel at some point. And he said, "Well, I'll train you to be a college president." And I said, "Really? You see that potential?" And he said, "Yeah, I think, not He was very clear. I mean, he was very direct and very honest, which I appreciated. He said, "Look, I don't think you'll ever be a president of an R1 institution because you don't come from academia, but there are certain institutions that I think you'd be a great fit for, and let's get you trained up for that." And so I took on that opportunity, and he did a great job of training me, mostly by giving me every difficult project that he didn't want to touch, is what he would tell you.
Oh, wow. What a great boy, there is so much in this story that can be unwrapped in terms of how one winds up someplace. I mean, the mentoring, the fact that you were identified as someone with talent. I would imagine you had not thought of the college presidency maybe before, or or maybe you
I
had.
had yeah, I had seen a couple of people make that transition. Jonathan Algers was
Oh,
one who I really admired and followed his career and had a chance to meet him when I was part of the National Association of College University Attorneys. And there were a couple others, but I thought it was a really, like, 1 in 100 got that opportunity. It just didn't seem very likely. So, yeah, it was a real surprise and a big honor, and also, um, felt like, it was kinda shocking that the chancellor would pick me out and see that, potential in me.
what do you think he saw? Just curious. What maybe you asked him at some point.
Well, I was really good at solving pretty challenging problems,
Uh-huh.
and we had a couple of serious issues while I was at the university that I jumped in on. One was we had a significant arc flash explosion where one of our employees ended up dying from it, and several others were really injured. It was a big investigation, and the board of governors was involved from the whole UNC system. Um, and I did a lot of the work with the OSHA investigation and leading a task force that reviewed the situation and came up with recommendations and such. And I think I learned at that point I have an ability to take a lot of really complex legalistic information and simplify it and make it easily understandable for the layperson and find a story there, which I think comes from the background of being a litigator where you learn how to that you don't have to know everything, right? You learn
Sure.
to find your expert witnesses around you, the people who are subject matter experts, utilize their strength and information, and then try to figure out how to make that into a story that anyone can understand and make it relatable and what lessons you need to take away from it. And so I think that's where I first gained attention. And then I ended up having to investigate my chancellor on a whistleblower complaint, which is a very unusual situation to be in. He was completely cleared. I had to, but I had to do it in a way where it was really clear I had integrity in that process
Sure.
and I was going to be unbiased and I was going to have somebody overseeing me to bring objectivity so nobody ever questioned that he had influenced my work in doing that investigation since I ultimately reported to him.
Mm,
That was originally what the board wanted me to do, and I had to go back even as a pretty young attorney and say, "That isn't going to work for you all. Ultimately, that setup will not bring about trust and transparency and belief in the outcome regardless of what it is. So we really need to come up with a process where nobody questions whether it was done appropriately and with integrity."
yeah. What, what wonderful training. As you describe this, I can see how appropriate it all is for what a college president has to do on a daily basis. So you wound up in your first presidency at Converse College. So I'm assuming you went right from the chief of staff role into the presidency at Converse College. Is that right?
Yeah, and it was the first presidency I applied for and didn't think I was gonna get. I just thought it was gonna be a great learning experience to see
Sure.
what the process was like, and then I got it and went, "Oh, no."
Well, your chancellor obviously prepared you well, but you were also, I'm sure, ready for it if you were called into the role. So what was it like? you never know, right? When you get into a position,
Yeah.
you may imagine what it's going to be like, but you never can fully understand until you get into it. So, how did you find the presidency and how did it differ from maybe what you thought it would be? What did you
Yeah.
learn? Were there things you had to unlearn from your
Yeah.
previous roles?
Yeah. A great question. So, one of the things that was really different and challenging for me was watching the chancellor of a large public institution that had grown from 15,000 students to 29,000 while I was there, and then going to be a president of an institution with 1,200 students in a very small town. And it was a very different presidency. And I think that took me time to understand that the expectations were different, the relationship models were very different, the relationship with the board was very different. And so I came in with a I tend to be pretty reserved and sort of shy on a personal level, and that had never been really a problem before, but it was in my first presidency, right? So I had to really learn to become that persona of a president where you're a cheerleader and you're outgoing and you're gregarious and you wave at everybody. And in a small town, that was really critical. And I just didn't understand that going into it. And so there were, that made in some ways my presidency harder because I had to learn that. And it took a little bit of time to understand what was necessary. I think the other thing that new presidents maybe don't understand, or at least I certainly didn't understand, is just how lonely it is, how often you're making decisions and you don't know if they're the right decisions and you don't know if you have anyone who's going to back you up and you really are out there on your own. And that can be a tough place to be, particularly when you're in a small community and living under a microscope and in a fishbowl. Like it's a challenging way to kind of go into that role.
And as you know well, because now in your second presidency, every college has its own culture. Every college has its own way of doing things, and it takes a long time to figure it out. So, and you had, and even your college experience as a student. I believe you were a student at a public. Did you go to public?
I did. Yeah, I went to the University of Missouri first and then the University of Nebraska, and then I
Sure.
went to William and Mary Law School. So I had
Sure.
only attended public institutions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So going to a very small private institution, the only experience I had to draw on was I went to high school in a very rural
Sure.
high school where my graduating class was 46 people, right? And so that gave me a bit of perspective. But no, it was a steep learning curve and one that I made plenty of errors while climbing.
So, what did you learn about yourself in those early years at Converse? What did the experience teach you?
I learned where I really had to step up and over communicate, how important it was I mean, really, you have to say something 7 or 8 times before it kicks in, and it's still something I have to remind myself of that about the time I feel like people must think this is the only thing I know how to say, or the only thing I can talk about. That's when it's actually starting to sink in for most people, and that's a really hard thing to learn because you feel like, "Well, I've said it before," but you have to keep saying it over and over again. Um, I've coined the phrase, "People hear what they fear," because I've learned that the first time you say something, a lot of times people will pick out what they fear you're going to say, and you have to keep delivering the message in a different way and trying to think ahead for what people are going to fear that you're saying and try to address that head on in whatever you're saying. That the pace of change requires time for people to process and grieve and deal with emotions and go through that change management timeline. And that is really critical. And how you engage in that is really critical.
Boy, those are such important takeaways and learnings. So, how have you, as a leader, if you think about your leadership style and how you have evolved, how would you describe that arc? thinking about when you first went into the presidency at Converse and how you lead now. Is it a different style? Does it look different in practice or not?
Yeah, it is. I think I've learned to be more comfortable with bringing my authentic self to it and not being perfect and laughing at myself and knowing that people won't think less of me for those imperfections. But if you embrace it with humbleness, it can be a positive. I thought for a long time I really had to be as perfect as possible or face challenges, and there were certainly those moments, but I think overall, the more authentic you are, the more joy you can find, the more relationship oriented it is, the better your leadership is, particularly for smaller institutions, but I think probably across all institutions. I really learned to think of my board more as peers than my boss and really lean into that space and put them to work in areas where I needed their help, including asking for large gifts, bringing them alongside with me, trying to really give them assignments even at times in areas where maybe I didn't have as much experience and I needed their technical or business acumen to help bring me along. And that's been really critical. And then understanding that there's a lot of work that's going on outside of the boardroom, thinking about how you prepare for what's happening in the boardroom. And I really had to learn that at a women's college where the board had a lot of members who were the spouses of alumni. And so they were in the room making the decision, but they also had to go home and reconcile that decision with who was often the real decision maker, and so that was an added layer of complexity in trying to work with the spouse often of the board member so that when they got to the board meeting, everybody knew what was going on and was communicated with, and I had a sense of where it was gonna go.
Boy, what an interesting dynamic. But again, I can see how that has prepared you well for leading and working with boards. I also can see your law background in what you're describing in terms of using board members as experts and so on. So, Krista, if I were to follow you around on the campus, what would I see in terms of your leadership style? How does it actually play out in practice? How do people experience you as a leader, do you think?
But that's always hard to answer for yourself. I like to walk around campus, I don't like to be in the cart, and, well, people would say I walk very fast even in heels, so I tend to be, fast-paced. I like to say hi to everybody I meet. I like to stop by if there are groups touring campus and introduce myself and try to answer any questions and such. Yeah, I think it's really trying to lean into that role of being the cheerleader for the place that you're serving, listening to people, not letting them give you their problems necessarily, but helping them find the solution without taking the problem on yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Are there some things that you try to model intentionally in how you lead or then maybe that reflect your own philosophy of leadership?
I think that listening is really important. Listening to what people say, but also what they don't say can tell you a lot. So I tend to ask a lot of questions. I find that that law background of asking good questions, asking open-ended questions. I'm not treating anyone as a hostile witness typically. I want them to tell me really what's going on, and not interrupting them. It was one of the greatest lessons I got from William and Mary was this first lesson on how to interview a witness, and that you ask an open-ended question and you don't interrupt them at all. You don't ask clarifying questions, you don't write any notes, you don't go through the timeline, you just let them talk. And then you go back and you start to try to have them walk through it again and take notes and fill in gaps and such and listen to it again because they'll start to remember to think about things that they didn't tell you either. And so I find that that method of listening is really helpful. Thinking about the group dynamics and how you bring groups together to encourage the exchange of ideas. I like to hear all sides of an argument. So, to make the best decision, I really want my cabinet and others to give me different perspectives, and I'll change my mind. I mean, I really want to get the right answer. It doesn't need to be my answer. I really want to hear what the best answer is. And sometimes it comes from really unexpected places, and I love those moments. So I think it's that inquisitive style, I try to keep as little ego in that as possible. I really don't that's not what drives me. I really try to find the best answer, and I figure if I'm doing the right work and it's student focused, then the kudos and the accolades will take care of themselves. I'm just here to try to do the best work I can for the people I'm serving.
You have the experience. You've completed most of the coursework in a doctoral program, but you have not completed that dissertation. Now you have a path to leave your ABD, that's all but dissertation status, behind with Bay Path University. Our innovative Doctor of Education and Educational Leadership ABD degree completion program makes it easier than ever for qualified candidates to finish what you started. Our one-of-a-kind program builds on your previous experience with coursework designed to strengthen your innovative leadership mindset and gain the skill set you need to lead and to transform educational institutions for the 21st century. The coursework for the ABD degree completion program is entirely online and can be completed in well under 2 years. What's more, you will have an abundance of support along the way, from your dedicated faculty advisor to your small dissertation seminar group of classmates with whom you will meet regularly for dissertation advisement and much needed encouragement. With Bay Path University, there's no reason to wait any longer. Trade up from ABD to EDD and take your place among the next generation of educational leaders. For more information, visit our website at baypath.edu/EDD. Don't wait a minute longer. Make today the day you finish what you started.
So is there a superpower there somewhere? Is there something that really defines who you are at your core as a leader?
Uh, I do think listening is an underappreciated skill, and I really try to listen without thinking about my next question or thinking about being defensive. I try to hear not just what people are saying, but how they're feeling in the moment because it's often the feelings that are more critical than the message or as critical as the message. And so um, I think it takes time and you have to give it some time and you can't be in too much of a hurry.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think listening is sorely undervalued today, particularly in leadership training. And yet I have seen what you're talking about play out with leaders that when they do take the time to listen and try to understand all the different things that are going on, that aren't always on the surface, it helps you get to the root of the problem. You wind up understanding what the real problem is more quickly, as
Yeah,
opposed to solving something that's really not. It may be more tangential to what you think is the problem.
yeah. And I have to learn to slow down often. That's one of the things that's
Mm,
always a challenge for me. I keep that proverb on my screen of if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go
mhm,
far, go together.
mm.
And that's a good reminder for me that oftentimes I have to move at a pace that's much slower than I want to move at, but people need time to process the way I had on the front end to often process that they did not. And I need to give them that time as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to switch topics a little bit and talk about decision making. And you talked about decision making early in our conversation. What kinds of decisions carry the greatest weight for you as a president?
Any decision that impacts students is going to carry the greatest weight for me. I really embrace this role because I truly believe in how education can transform futures. It was why, from that very early age, I saw education as maybe it was a pathway to security even when the world felt so insecure and so I hate wasted potential, and I never want to do anything that derails a student or that inhibits their progress. And so I think that's my lodestone in any decision making. Decisions that where people's livelihood is impacted is always those are always really, really hard. And so those are the ones that tend to stick with me and that I often, sometimes go back and think, gosh, was that the right thing to do? Was there another way to do that? Um, yeah, those are the ones that weigh on me the most.
How do you usually make your decisions? So, especially when you have hard decisions to make, is there a process you go through or certain
Yeah.
people you always consult or
Yeah, I try to gather as much information as possible and think about what the impact is of not making a decision in that moment or not calling the question. I had a rear admiral who was on my board of trustees who asked me the question, I think about it all the time, is what is the question we're scared to ask ourselves? And so I often go back to what is it we're scared to ask ourselves, or what is it that people are scared of that's the elephant in the room that nobody wants to give voice to, and how do I answer that question first? So when I make tough decisions, I spend some time gathering data, making sure it's the right data, bringing in the right resources. If it's a really critical decision, I never want to under-resource that decision. And there are times when I'll let the data tell me what that decision is, where there was a merger that we did where it was a really close call on whether it was one we were going to take on. And I told the board, I haven't made up my mind yet. I'm still going through the data and doing my due diligence before I come to you with a recommendation." And they kept pushing me. "Well, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should do?" I was like, "I'm still gathering this data. You're going to have to let me do my due diligence period, and I'll bring it to you together with my recommendation. But then you need to kick the tires and tell me what's wrong. What am I missing? What other questions do we need to be asking ourselves?" So, and I do that with my cabinet as well. I really want to create an open space of true discernment and trying to find the right decision. And that means I have to be willing to change directions. But there are also decisions where you have to realize what the cost is of not making a decision, and a lot of times people underestimate that when you're choosing not to make a decision, you're still making a decision, and that can have as much or more cost. You just don't usually take the time to discern what the implications of that are, what that can be. An example of not making a decision?
yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So let's say, we're trying to decide on a merger or acquisition, and you delay on making the decision. That can often slip through your hands. And we had to call the question. We had one that was really quite close, as I said, and we had to talk about what will get delayed if we move forward with this, and what opportunities are we losing if we don't move forward with this. And so as we look back at our strategic plan, here's what we set out as our big goals. How does this match our goals, and how does not doing it align with our goals or misalign with those goals? And it was when I got people to think about this could slip through our fingers. We could let it go. And what does that look like for you, for the university, that it changed their mind. I mean, they didn't wanna do the work. They were like, "Not another one. This is too much." And they're ton of work, right? They just require a lot of detailed work on data integration and team integration and organizational. I mean, it's just a lot of work. But when they saw that we might walk away from it and they had to think about what the outcome of that was, they actually came to the table and said, "You know what? I really do wanna do this." And so it was calling that question out and making people think about that actually set the decision for that plan and made us move forward with the merger.
Yeah. What have been the most important things you've learned from leading mergers and expansions? And what would you say to somebody, another college president who may be considering going down this pathway?
Yeah, it takes a lot of work. I would start with, is the organization you're looking to merge with aligned with you in terms of principles, value, your philosophy on how you educate students. The second is you have to get really clear very fast on what it's going to look like at the end. Who's going to be in leadership? Who's gonna be in charge? Boy, what's the name gonna be? Who's gonna exist at the end? What's critical to preserve? What's not critical to preserve? You have to have really uncomfortable conversations with people who are not gonna be there. Um, and one of the things I learned, and I learned this by doing it the wrong way, is how when you're stuck in the Department of Ed's two-step process for an unknown amount of time, and for a while there, it was with an unknown criteria for success, how you lead during that moment, and it can get messy, but it's critical that you have clear leadership and you define what that interim phase looks like.
Yeah, that's not something that you think of right at the outset when you think about
Yeah.
leading through a merger, but it makes sense as you describe that.
And so it takes constant communication and clarification and clear delineation of roles.
Yeah, boy, and you better be sure at the outset this is what you really want to do. I imagine you learned a lot about resilience when you were a child and that has come into play time and again, particularly in situations like this, where you, as the leader, you've had to really be resilient and model resiliency as you're in that limbo period. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think one of the things that's critical as a leader is you have to be willing to do what's right by the institution in your best judgment and be honest about that, even if it's risking your career. I may come home without a job tonight. We just need to be really clear on that, and I think you have to be okay with that decision and be prepared for it and realize that your identity is not being president, that your identity is really separate from that. Your legacy is separate from that one decision. You have to find your way, I think, if you're going to lead with true integrity to putting it all on the line to do what you think is right.
So, the University of Redlands has undergone a lot of transformation under your leadership from everything that I've read. So, I'd love to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about the University of Redlands for people that may not be familiar, and then tell us how you think about leading change. So why don't you start by telling us about Redlands? What
Yeah.
are what would be important for people to take away?
So Redlands was founded in 1907, and as a California institution, that makes it pretty old.
Yeah.
It has this amazing combination of a liberal arts education at its core with pre-professional and professional programs, and it always envisioned itself that way. So in the very beginning, it adopted that kind of new American college model. And then it combines with this really unusual Johnston Integrative Center for Integrative Studies program where students can design their own degree. Their grades are designed by a holistic review. They don't get letter grades. They design contracts with their faculty in a living learning community their sophomore year. And they go through this holistic evaluation process by their faculty and their peers. Sometimes their parents even come back in and participate in that. And so it is this very unusual model. And what's great about that model is the University of Redlands, I think, has always been very innovative. It started the Whitehead Adult Education Program back in the 70s, really thinking about the non-traditional learner. It started campuses throughout Southern California to try to meet people where they were for non-traditional learners and degree completion and graduate programs and such. And so I think it was built into its DNA that it's willing to take on change, and that's what really drove me to the institution. I will say, when I first heard about it, I laughed and I said, "I'm not going to California. That's never going to happen." But when I learned about it, I thought, "Oh, there are a lot of really great elements here that would be fun to build on." At a board that wasn't just hoping to preserve it as it is, but really is trying to build a better university going forward. And I think you have to get that alignment for yourself as a leader and what's important to you with your institution and your board. And then I think to go through that kind of change without losing soul, you have to continue to keep listening. And it's not easy. I mean, people don't like change, especially rapid change in a time of rapid change coming out of a pandemic and change that is not guaranteed to be successful. And so it requires creating space for people to have fun. And as we were going through the idea of this merger, we brought Woodbury people to the Redlands campus and we did a tour and we played kickball together and we had fun together and we did vice versa at the other campus. And you have to appreciate the culture of the institution that you're merging with and know that you don't want to change all of that. Like, that's a special place with its own history, its own culture. What do you preserve and keep in that and honor there while also making the business functions work together?
When you think about Redlands specifically, how do you think about honoring the history while still moving the institution forward?
I think most important to protect is that the educational experience the students have. That's what the alumni remember.
Mm.
It's that wholesome experience of classroom, co-curricular, extracurricular, the fact that we have community service learning and experiential learning and practical skills that are built into the classroom and not just theoretical. And Woodbury has a lot of that as well. So 100% of their students have to have an internship before they graduate. 100% of ours do a community service internship before they graduate. They're both hands-on communities in a number of ways. They're both really focusing on the student experience and engagement. So you try to think about how you make all of that work. You focus on what's important, and that's trying to build the reputation of Redlands, adding complementary academic programs that you would have wanted to do anyway, but would have been hard to start on your own. And then trying to find that those compromise moments of how you bring those campuses together. Going back to the history was really important. And then I always like to have my cake and eat it too. So could I carve out a Converse college for women as keeping that same role as a distinct of the new vision for Converse University as a coeducational university? And then as I think through the mergers, I look for that same opportunity. What aspects can we preserve there that are really core to their history, their alumni experience, the things that connect them to that institution? While also bringing them in and finding that right connection, and it's sort of a fun problem or puzzle to solve.
So what do you look for in the leaders who you invite onto your senior team?
Integrity, never you can't even have a seat at the table if I don't think you're gonna act with integrity. I don't do dirty yeses. Don't tell me yes if you don't mean yes. I wanna hear no. Let's find our way to the best solution. I don't want somebody who thinks like me. I really want somebody who thinks very differently than me, even though that's challenging, at the moment and can even, kinda irk you at times when you're in a meeting. It's really valuable to have a different way of thinking, around you. Yeah, I want people who are innovative. I want strong work ethic. Yeah, that's really what I'm looking for. Teamwork, no jerks, right? You need to be focused on the mission and not yourself and not your ego.
So we're at the end of our time, and I want to end by asking you more about women's experience
Hmm.
in particularly in higher education. So I'm curious what you think or what you wish maybe more women understood before stepping into senior leadership roles, maybe what they should perhaps know that you now know.
Yeah, sometimes the people that are most resistant to change and to women's leadership are other women, and that can really catch you off guard, can be really hard. And I think we're in a time where there is a push back on women leadership and diversity and that change, and we're seeing a younger generation that is being somewhat indoctrinated into this kind of traditional roles and trying to push back on that. And that is a hard moment to be in. And I think you have to understand how important representation now is for young women, but also really for young men, and how you show up in that moment when they are hearing a lot of things on social media that are trying to regress back to a male dominated society. And it is a really critical moment, I think.
So if you are an emerging leader, let's say you're a young woman looking at your pathway, are there a handful of things you would advise that she do to help prepare her? I mean, you were fortunate you had somebody who identified you and uh, sounds like mentored you well, but I'm curious now, knowing all that you know, how you might advise other younger women.
Yeah, I think it's really critical to get a mentor and an advocate, and those should be two different people. A mentor is going to be honest with you about where you have work to grow and help you find your pathway there, and where you can divulge your own insecurities and challenges and ask questions. The advocate is someone who will help you raise up in your career and find new pathways, but that you don't want to be sharing all of your insecurities with necessarily, or having that exchange with. And sometimes I think people confuse those, and it's important to separate them. Get a coach, get a coach young, find somebody you can talk to, especially as a new president. It's really important, and it's underrated, and I would say negotiate for it in your contract. And know early on, try to discern early on if the organization you're going to join is going to match with your values and what you want to accomplish, what's important to you as a legacy, or and then make your determination based on that, and not just on whether this is the right next step in your career to grow. It has to also, at this stage, it's too important to miss on the place that you're joining as a new leader.
So, final question. What kind of leadership do you believe higher education will require in the years ahead, regardless of institutional type? What's going to be most important?
You have to build back trust. I think it's really critical that we've lost a lot of trust. But we also have to call out the bigger issue here, and I think the bigger issue is the as a country, we used to talk about education a lot more. We talked about, regardless of which party, we talked about education as fundamental to national security, to growth of the nation, to building a better tomorrow. And we're not talking about that the same way we used to talk about it, even under President Reagan and others. And we have shifted from this idea of higher education as a public good, and we've focused on it as a private commodity. And we need higher education leaders, regardless of what kind of institution they're serving, that talk about how critical this is to our democracy and to the welfare of the nation and to the next generation, and to going through this next stage of AI, or what this is going to mean in technology, and who are focusing on the people and the relationships and the integrity of the position. Because if we don't build back trust and we don't start to see this as critical to a strategy for national growth, we will lose it. And we are going to see more institutions close, and we are going to see we're going to focus on the wrong things. And we're already starting to see, I think, a loss of research and those who are doing that research to other countries in some of these critical moments.
That is a very fitting word to end on. So, Krista, thank you so very much
Thank
for
you, Melissa.
this. Has been just a wonderful conversation. I have learned so much from you, and I again appreciate your time, and I can hardly wait until our listeners get to hear your story and learn more about you.
Well, thank you for the time, and appreciate you inviting me here.
And that's a wrap on today's IngeniousU episode. A very big thank you for tuning in and sharing this time with us. Don't forget to stay in the loop with our Center for Higher Education Leadership and Innovative Practice, the hub that brings this podcast to life. CHELIP is also behind the free monthly webinars on all things cutting edge in higher ed and offers some terrific certificate programs to boot. Have you checked out our YouTube channel yet? It's where the magic of our top-rated episodes from past seasons comes alive with video interviews. Hit that subscribe button so you're always in the know with our latest and greatest content. Like what you heard? Take a moment to rate and review IngeniousU on your podcast platform of choice. Spread the word to your friends and colleagues and invite them to join our IngeniousU circle. Until next time, keep innovating, keep inspiring, and keep making a difference. Stay safe, stay connected, and above all, stay ingenious.